what is colonialism?
Uh, Great question to start with, John. Frankly, I prefer to avoid the word because the ism implies something coherent and unitary and cohesive, as if there was a thing. And so whenever we use the word colonialism, stick it on something, we know what it is. And usually nowadays, colonialism connotes something bad. It was racist, it was oppressive, it was economically exploitative. It involved, as a friend of mine remarked when I first got into trouble on this topic, it's all about oppression and subjugation. And in fact, if you look at the history of the British Empire, which lasted 400 years from 1550, 1960, thereabouts, and stretched from Newfoundland in eastern Canada to New Zealand, just above the Antarctic. It was many different things at different times and in different places, sometimes different things at the same time in different places. So I talk about imperial government or colonial government. You can talk about colonization. Not all empires were colonial. Not every part of the British Empire was colonial. Um, okay, to get back to the question you asked about what is it? Empire. Let's start with empire. Empire is a political organization where one people dominates other peoples. And colonization is where one people lands on the territory of another people and sets up shop in large numbers. So certainly Europeans colonized North America to the point where white Europeans outnumbered native North Americans by the middle of the 19th century. Europeans also colonized Australia. Europeans did not colonize India. The Brits did not colonize India. They took over government. But even at the height of the British Raj in India in 1900, there were 300 million Indians. How many Brits? 164,000. These were not people who took over large tracts of territory in the whole. They were soldiers, certainly, administrators, financiers, traders. Yes, toward the end of the 19th century, you do get planters in northeast, the northeast of British India. So they buy land and they take over territory, but they're very small in number, and the amount of territory taken over is quite small. So empire doesn't necessarily involve colonization.
Hmm.
Does that help?
It does. It does help. The question that I'm diving into a bit earlier than I anticipated, but there are. So some of those numbers you talked about there, 164,000 British at the height of the Raj, 300 million Indians. Depending on where you go looking on the internet, particularly with right-coded discourse, i.e. those leaning right-wing, you can find people suggesting that Britain itself is experiencing a kind of colonization due to the high numbers of immigrants that are coming in. What do you make of that notion? Do you think that there is the experience of mass immigration in Britain does stand up to scrutiny if we were to say that there is a type of colonization taking place, or does something else need to be happening for that to be true?
That's a really interesting question. And as you were posing it, I was going over in my mind and saying yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. So on the one hand, my one reaction could be, well, most of the immigration is legal. That's to say, we let it happen. So if colonization takes place without the consent of the natives, in this case, we're the natives, then that's not colonization. But colonization of North America and New Zealand and even Australia did not always occur without consent.
Mm.
I mean, certainly sometimes British people took over territory, they seized it without the consent of the natives. Sometimes in North America, they walked onto territory that was vacant. Yes, it was vacant sometimes in the 1600s because European imported diseases had decimated the local population, who had then moved, leaving land vacant. Sometimes, and this was generally imperial policy. Normally, land would be occupied with the consent of the natives. Now, it didn't always happen, but often it did happen by treaty for one reason or another. So it's actually not true to suppose that colonization is necessarily coerced and unwelcome. So you could say, yes, you could say we're being colonized now, but largely without consent. But here would be the difference. Way back, in Roman times or even Greek times, you have Greeks and Romans sailing across the Mediterranean to Sicily or North Africa and setting up colonies. Now, these are cities with walls around them, with Greeks and Romans inside, and they dominate that territory. And the natives of North Africa or Sicily, they do their own thing. So the peoples are separate. Ideally, here, when we admit immigrants who are going to be permanent residents, ideally they should integrate and assimilate, because Britain is not anywhere. We have certain traditions, we have laws, we have customs, we have a language. So in a sense, what ought to be happening is a measure of integration and assimilation. Now, I say a measure because, of course, there's no good reason why, let's say, people from Asia shouldn't carry on making curry or manning restaurants that we love to eat at. So in other words, you can retain your own culture, but I think when you move to another country permanently, you do need to pay sufficient respect to learn the language so you can participate and to obey the laws and the customs. And colonization would not involve that. It would involve a kind of creation of an enclave that you control with or without consent of the native peoples. But you wouldn't have colonists would not, as it were, assimilate into a larger population. But that's my initial thought on that.
Yeah, and I think that probably stacks up with those who've conducted work in this area. I don't know if you've read Paul Collier's book Exodus. I can't remember the subtitle. Yeah, it is very good. Yep. Where he said once you start reaching certain numbers of incomers, regardless of where it is, let's just run it as a hypothetical. You get to a point where a diaspora forms, and that diaspora has enough social and cultural capital that it doesn't actually need to interact with whoever it is that they're surrounded by and who were the original inhabitants, because they can set up their own economic systems to a certain degree. They can all help each other out, and they don't necessarily need to interact. And on top of that, culture is obviously driven by a whole bunch of things, whether it's religion, whether it's the place that you originally came from. And if people decide that is much more worthy to hand down than wherever the place is they found themselves, then those diasporas become self-sustaining, and in some respects, I suppose, do get to the point you just talked about, which is an enclave which is effectively under control of whoever that group might be, because of the nature of the diaspora.
That's a very, very good point. So yes, an enclave, or what you might call a ghetto, is a colony. And yes, I have read Paul Collier's book, and just to be absolutely clear, I mean, he's not against immigration, and nor am
No,
I,
he's not.
nor you.
No.
He is in favor of the control of immigration
Hmm.
precisely because if you get large numbers of people coming from one part of the world and landing in another at the same time or in a short space of time, naturally, quite naturally, they congregate with their own kind, and they don't integrate, and that can cause problems for social cohesion. So in the early noughties, when I was living in Leeds, I remember having a conversation. There were some riots in Leeds, Bradford, not all involving young Asian men, also white men. But I remember asking the faith advisor to the Bishop of Bradford, what were the Anglican churches doing to try and build bridges between the white community and the Asian community in Bradford?
Hmm.
And he said, well, we try. The problem is that they're not interested. Why?
Hmm.
Because they have a self-contained community. They marry among their own, they trade with their own, they speak their own language, and they're self-contained. And I think that is a problem for larger social cohesion. And I think it's not inappropriate. I mean, strictly speaking, given all that we've said, it's not inappropriate to refer to that as a kind of colony,
Hmm.
because it's not integrated. And that would be a feature of a colony, of a Greek colony in North Africa or Sicily. It's not integrated into a larger nation.